The year is 2021, and we have now entered the third millennia. We've departed from the 20th century and all of its horrors, the 100 years, which is responsible for the violent death of more individuals than the previous 19 centuries combined. But the imprint of war and tyranny upon the Western conscience, it's large. And we're still asking the same perennial question of what is it that makes societies crumble? How is it that the carnage unleashed upon the world in the 20th century occurred? And these are questions that are difficult to answer, and they're nuanced and complicated. But there are men and women who have taken up the task of thinking these things through long before us, and one of them is Alexander Solzhenitsyn. This is a man who not only studied the Russian Revolution and the USSR, but he lived through it. And his analysis of how such violence occurred was ideology. And when we think of ideologies in the modern sense, we think of conservatism or liberalism or libertarianism, like just another worldview. But ideologies are not that. They're something different. Ideology is reference to a religion that is posing as a political theory. A religion that is posing as a political theory. And what is it that I mean by that? What are the questions that religion answers? It tells us of our origin. It tells us of meaning, of purpose in this life. It tells us the design of everything, and it tells us of a salvation to come. Political theories, they tell us how we ought to orient our state. Important questions, but they don't answer the deeper why questions that all humans crave on some level of analysis. But what happened when the European mind did away with God? It was up to the political theories to answer those why questions, and Marxism became animated with a religious fervor, telling of a salvation to come, not in an age to come, but a utopia to be ushered in now by the hands of human work. Marxism guaranteed purpose to those who followed it. You see, these political theories, they subsequented the role of religion, but as a perverted form of this. And it is these ideologies that Solzhenitsyn credited with the horrors of the 20th century. Men, shells, animated by the beliefs and the creeds of this system, were made to do horrendous tasks, justifying them by means of the ideologies. But gone are those days. With the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, man, he moved beyond ideology. It was the triumph of liberalism. And that very well might have been the case. But now we have seen the return of ideologies. Our political scene is so divided that there seems to be no clarity. But it seems to me to make sense of this return to ideology, of the return to people treating politics as a religious entity, a return to the very fact and feature which made the 20th century possible. We have to understand why it occurred. And it is my thesis today that atomization is the prerequisite to ideology. For people to accept these political religions, they have to be spread out, divided, withdrawn from the ecosystem of society. Atomization is the prerequisite to ideology. And what is it that I mean by atomization? Atomization is the process by which individuals in a society withdraw from civic engagement and exist on entities unto themselves. Loneliness, the angst that accompanies the 21st century man, are the result of this atomization. And it is this state of solitude that makes men susceptible to ideology. And someone who understood this rather well was Alexis de Tocqueville. Now, de Tocqueville, he was a Frenchman. And he's writing off the heels of the French Revolution and the multiple governments that France cycled through in their attempt to find political stability. But he comes to America and he pens his magnum opus, Democracy in America. And in there you can see the juxtaposition and the tension existing between the French Revolution and the American system of government. And he's stuck by this question of why. Why was his home nation in such disarray when the American Revolution ended in certain degree of stability? And among other things, do you want to know what Alexis de Tocqueville pegged as the reason for this? It's what he called the art of association. Men lived in an interconnected bond with one another, and that meant they had meaning outside of politics. They weren't these fragmented individuals who had no engagement in the civic arena, far from it. But in France, France fell slave to a political religion, to a democratic theocracy informed by the scriptures of Rousseau and the new ecclesiastical structure of Robespierre. But this might not seem to fully make sense. What is it about associations? What is it about not withdrawing to yourself that keeps people from looking to totalitarian systems of thought? Well, to understand that, we have to look to a system like the USSR. And what does Stalin do? Stalin got rid of all the associations that existed in Russian society, even the Marxist groups. Why? Because each of these groups that kindled a connection between people was something that existed outside of politics. It was something that the state couldn't quite get their hand upon. You see, totalitarianism, that word has been butchered. But what it means is a political system that touches upon the totality of things. It is a religious system. It answers why. It answers over all things. But with each and every association that an individual is a part of, he moves beyond the iron grip of the totalitarianism matrix. And you can even think about this in your own life. You know, if you have one main interest, you rise or fall according to that interest. But there's this idea of off-phase passions. And what that means is in your own life. If you're an artist, learn to cultivate a sport. If you're an accountant, read works of literature. Develop off-phase talents that you may not be subject to the whims of the one thing which you're dependent on. But if you're a totalitarian ideology, you require sole allegiance. And Leszek Kolakowski, who was a Polish dissident, he notes this cognitive dissonance that he observed in the USSR. And it is that they required unity under Marxist thought, but isolation in all else. Men had to come together under the banner of Marxism, but in the rest of their walk of life, they had to be separate, they had to be atomized. Unity in the state, seclusion, and all else. And they feed one another because you have to hollow out the minds of men to fill them with this new shallow quasi-religion. The prerequisite to submerging ideologies in the hearts of a population is they can have no other associations throughout. And in the USSR with Stalin, this had to happen by force, but in America, this is happening organically. There's a brilliant political scientist by the name of Robert Putnam, and he conducted a study in the late 20th century, published in his book, Bowling Alone. And he documents the collapse of American communities. And what he notices is, look, he picks up and he begins with the de Tocquevillian observation that the beauty of America lies in their multiple associations, but what has occurred in the last third of the 20th century? The decay and the removal of this association. No longer is the American citizen called upon to live in the civic realm. Self-interest has been proclaimed now as the highest good. Live as an entity unto yourself. Withdraw from the community and a community that may very well need you. So a generation has now been raised that lacks the community that structured the American polis for generations past. Struck by loneliness and isolation, they enter a political scene. And rather than falling slave to the nihilism associated with this lack of association, people are running toward the rigid dogma of political religions. Because these political religions, they offer a clear-cut definition of good and evil. They promise religious significance. Hannah Arendt, she made this observation when she was looking at Nazi Germany. She said, the converts to Nazism, they aren't concerned with questions of the state. They're looking for meaning. They're looking for significance. You see, the sweet tune of ideology, it can only be heard by those who know the inhumane state of loneliness. It is in this loneliness that ideology comes upon men. When one is in solitude, there is a lack and a lessening of face-to-face interaction that animates everyday life. It is in this face-to-face interaction that we go through the difficult process of building and cultivating long-term relationships. But what happens in lieu of this? We subvert into the abstract and we think of groups on this lofty level. The group is easy to hate. You can write off the Jew, the kulak, whatever minority group or group of individuals it is you wish to oppress. If you're doing it on an abstract level of the group, it is possible, but it is in face-to-face interactions of individual connection that we see the neat categories of ideologies become divided. And Solzhenitsyn, what is his fundamental critique of the ideology? He says the Marxist mistake is that they don't understand that the line between good and evil, it doesn't run through political parties. It's not Republicans good and Democrats bad or vice versa. It's not at the level of institutions, no, it's at the level of the heart. And the problem is when a society is atomized, they're no longer having face-to-face connection. But in America, we're growing apart into almost two separate Americas informed by two separate political religions. And this has only been informed by the technological revolution. You see Robert Putnam, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Alexis de Tocqueville, the individuals we've discussed, they were writing and being informed by an era that existed before technology. But this problem has only compounded the matter. Technology allows us to retreat back to ourselves, to withdraw, to live in almost a sociological solipsism, where we no longer interact and are vibrant members of the community. And it is this specter that now haunts the United States. And the literature on the political polarization is very striking when you line it up with what is happening in technology. It can almost be directly correlated. And it's because when you go online, you're dealing with an abstracted member of a group. You're not associating with your fellow Americans. You become an online warrior. And there's a certain oxymoron to what has occurred. Gregory Wolfe, he points this out, that we talk about culture wars in our highly polarized environment where ideologies live. Culture wars. But what is a culture? A culture is that which brings a group of people together, unifies them, whether on the level of ideas or associations. But what is a war? A war is what pits two people against one another. Culture wars are not sustainable. Political ideologies are not sustainable. So how is it that we can avoid the latter end? Well, there are two men who have considered this matter at length, and they seem to inform us on how we can escape that danger. And first comes from Joshua Mitchell, the author of American Awakening, and a man who's given deep thought to this subject. And what he notes is that it's going to take face-to-face interaction, daily acts of love that duplicate the life of Christ, that we may show love to one another and bridge those gaps. It's not going to happen on the level of ideas or policy. And the second comes from Jordan Peterson, who notes that meaning seems to be the antidote to rigid political beliefs. And meaning that is found in the associations of life, in taking on responsibility in your community. So what then do we do? It seems to me that duplicating the act on the cross, we are supposed to act in love toward one another, to put a hole in the moral matrices of ideologies that write people off on the lines of group abstractions and instead find face-to-face interactions where humans may rekindle connections for one another.